Hey guys, welcome to physics, and this is the first in our video lectures for physics this year, and it's just to give you an opportunity to get used to the format, to how these lectures are going to go, and also to give you a little bit of an introduction to what we're going to be looking at and talking about and thinking about this year. So obviously, physics is a specific discipline under the heading of science. And as the great Seymour Skinner once said regarding this subject, there's nothing more exciting than science. You get all the fun of sitting still, being quiet, writing down numbers, paying attention. Yes, science has it all. Obviously, this is not actually what we want this year to be like. We'll certainly be writing down a lot of numbers and hopefully paying attention, but we're going to be doing a lot of moving around, a lot of hands-on stuff, very little sitting still and being quiet if the year goes according to plan. As we go through the year, though, there's some kind of major ideas that I need you guys or want you guys to understand. And as an aside, as you're watching these videos, definitely we should be taking notes. Definitely you should be actively engaged in the video. Don't have it off to the side while you're watching TV or listening to music or something like that. While this one isn't going to have a whole lot of specific information that you're going to have to memorize or have a strong grasp of later, as we get into the notes, there will be significant material, and if you don't pay attention, then you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what to ask about. And the follow-up questions the next day after you watch these notes when we're working in class, that's really where that understanding is going to be. These notes videos are just to lay the basic foundation, to give you some factual information, definitions, equations, things like that. But it's going to be when we put them into practice in the classroom that you're really going to hopefully understand the big ideas and how everything works together. So some big ideas that aren't just specifically physics related, but science in general. The difference between laws, theories, hypotheses. So our scientific laws, things like Newton's universal law of gravitation, that we'll talk about later this year. These are statements of what is happening. They're factual, they're typically mathematical relationships, particularly in physics, but they don't attempt to explain why. They simply say what is going on, not why it's happening. Our theories, on the other hand, tend to be the explanations of why something is happening. And it's a reasonable explanation. And that term reasonable is particularly important here. We can create all kinds of scientific theories, but if it's not grounded in scientific data, if it's not grounded in evidence, then it's not a scientific theory. There has to be some rationale. There has to be some reasoning behind it. But one, I think, common misconception is that if a theory is shown to be supported over and over enough times, that it becomes a law, and that's not actually how it works. Laws say what's happening. Theories explain why that law is happening. But typically what we do start with before we get to a theory is a hypothesis. And our hypotheses are possible answers to questions. Hypotheses should be testable. That means you should be able to say you think that this is going to be what's going to happen or why it happens, and you should be able to go out and collect data to support that theory or to support that hypothesis. But this dynamic piece to hypotheses is one of the most important parts of it. When investigating phenomena, a scientist might have some initial idea of why something's happening or what he's observing. But as you get into it, the data may not support that. And so you have to be flexible. You have to be able to change your ideas. You have to be able to adjust to what the data is telling you. The data isn't always going to support what you think. And so what you have to be prepared for is that when that data doesn't support your initial ideas, how are you going to change your ideas? How are you going to adjust your framework to explain what the data is actually telling you? Now, hypotheses are vastly different from speculations. We do not want to speculate in this class. Science is not about speculation. It's about thinking clearly through ideas and making reasonable hypotheses. Speculations are guesses. There's no foundation in data. There's no foundation in any empirical evidence. Hypotheses are good. Speculations are bad. A couple other pieces that we want to kind of have a general understanding of when we're talking through this class, through this year. And these are our C words, apparently. So we have this first one, which is certainty. And when we're talking about certainty, it's how well we know something to be true. Right? If you are 100% certain that something is true, then that's pretty solid. Very rarely are we 100% certain in science when it comes to our ideas and theories. But this level of certainty is limited by a couple things. It's initially limited by the method of the observation. So what tools are you using? So let's say, so this is our tools and measuring techniques. Okay, so measuring devices, measuring tools, and measuring techniques. How are we taking the measurement? And then the skill of the person who's making it. So when you're in kindergarten, you're probably not going to be able to measure the length of, say a piece of paper with a whole lot of certainty. You'll probably get it in the ballpark, right? But as you progress and as you practice measurement skills, and now that you're high schooler, now that you're in physics, the expectation is that you are much better equipped to use triple beam balances and electronic scales and other measuring devices that we're going to be using throughout the year with a certain degree of accuracy and precision. That you're going to take your time to read the device correctly and to pay attention to whether or not there's a meniscus if it's a graduated cylinder, and to estimate that first uncertain digit when you're using an analog device. But even with the best tools and even with seasoned scientists using them, there's never going to be such thing as an absolute certain anything, really, measurement, idea, whatever the case may be. There's always going to be room for error. There's always going to be uncertainty in your measurements, in your calculations. And our job as scientists, because even in here, while we're students, we're also still scientists because we're investigating the world around us. Our job as scientists is to reduce the uncertainty, to increase the certainty as much as feasibly possible, so that when we look at our data, when we make our conclusions, when we try and develop our ideas about the world around us, we can do so with the best knowledge possible. Now, as we collect that data and as we look at these relationships, there are two kind of types of relationships that we may come across. One is a causal relationship, and this is where, say, variable A causes variable B to occur. Somebody kicks you in the shin, your shin hurts. Okay? The kick caused the pain. That's a direct cause and effect between two events, and we see that clearly. The other type of relationship is a corollary or a correlation. And this is where a statistical relationship may exist between the events, and it can vary from 1 which means there's a perfect correlation or a direct relationship. Think a slope of 1, or in our rather, when we're looking at our R values when we're creating graphs, that value, the closer it is to 1, typically it's 0.8 to 0.9 or sometimes higher, that tells us how direct that relationship is, how good our data falls into that direct relationship. The difference between a causal relationship and a correlation is that even though there may be a very strong statistical relationship between the two variables, one variable doesn't necessarily cause the second thing, right? So you might have two variables that appear to be directly related. As one goes up, the other goes up, or as one goes down, the other goes down. But it's maybe not coincidence, but there's probably some type of relationship there, but the first variable isn't necessarily directly affecting the second one. So those are some of our big ideas in science, but what is this giant field that we call science? And if you look at all of the different disciplines within science, whether it's physics, whether it's biology, whether it's earth science, whether it's paleontology, the things that's common among all disciplines in science, no matter what type of science, is that within that discipline, the scientists are trying to understand, they're trying to discover, they're trying to figure out why things happen the way that they do. What's the nature of the universe? Why does the Earth rotate the way that it does as it travels around the sun? Why do earthquakes occur? Why do plants do photosynthesis? How do plants do photosynthesis? Right? So regardless of the specific discipline, all fields of science have that piece in common, where they're trying to figure out and understand better how the world around them, how the universe around them works. But really, it's a way of knowing. It's a way of thinking. So not just knowing, but thinking. I like that better. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of viewing. That's an awful W. A way of viewing or looking at the world around you. As you go about your daily life, as you walk around school or false church or wherever it is that you go on a daily basis, when you look around you, do you wonder why things occur? Do you try and find out why different things happen, or do you just accept them at face value? The nature of a scientist is simply asking questions. We're all scientists when we ask questions. We don't have to have a degree. We don't have to have gone to college. All you have to have is an innate curiosity about the world around you and the universe around you, and want to understand it better. And when you go out into the universe and you seek out those answers and you try and understand why things happen the way that they do, you're doing science. You are being a scientist simply by asking those questions and trying to understand the answers. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. One of my more favorite quotes, I guess, and it's kind of an old one, related to science, is this by Jules Henry Poincare. And he said that science is built with facts, just as a house is built with bricks. But a collection of facts cannot be called a science any more than a pile of bricks can be called a house. I think that's powerful. You might have had some classes in the past where you've been tasked to memorize a whole bunch of terminology, and you might have had to memorize equations, and you might have had to memorize and regurgitate a long list of facts. And well, that basic knowledge, that basic foundation is important. Memorizing a bunch of facts about the world around you isn't doing science. It isn't being a scientist. In order to be a scientist, you need to take those facts and that foundational knowledge and apply it to a broader scope. You need to be looking around. You need to be organizing it internally. You need to be putting all of those pieces together. So you have this long list of facts, but can you connect them? Can you connect the dots? Can you put those facts together in much the same way that a mason puts bricks together to build a house? And so as we build our scientific knowledge, there's some things we need to understand about it. Right? Yes, is some of it facts? Is our ability to move forward based on our knowledge of certain key information? Absolutely. But some other things we have to understand about this knowledge is that first, it's empirically based. Now, what does that mean? It means that there's evidence. It means that we're not just spouting wild claims, that there's observations, there's experience. It's not just theory. It's not just speculation. Right? So we have to have data. We have to have evidence. But just important, and we see this throughout history, as our empirical evidence changes, our understanding of the world has to change as well. And so scientific knowledge is tentative. It means it's not static. It means it's always changing as our understandings change. And as we gain more data. Gain new information. The things that we knew about the world, the things that we absolutely were certain about the universe 100 years ago, are not what we now know about the universe. The things that they knew about the universe 1,000 years ago, we might look back on now and say, that's silly, right? The idea that everything, all matter, is made up of fire and earth and air and ether, that might seem a little ridiculous to us now, but you have to put it into the perspective of the people at the time. What was their knowledge base? What was their foundation? And what were their observations about the world around them? And what tools did they have? And so as history progresses, and we can see this in many instances, and we'll talk about a lot of them as the year goes on, as technology advances, as our measurement tools improve, as we gain new knowledge, our understanding of the universe and how it works has to change as the evidence changes. If the evidence no longer supports a particular theory, then we have to throw that theory out, come back to the drawing board, and try and figure out what theory, what idea, what rationale does that evidence actually support. And as part of that, we certainly have the evidence, we certainly have the observation piece, but and this piece here and this piece here is the creative thinking and the inference. Those two things are kind of tied together because you have to take the data, and we don't always have the full picture. Right? Scientists don't always have every possible piece of data that they might need to say with certainty that something is true or false. And so you have to be a little creative. You have to, Einstein is a great example, right? He didn't have data that told him about general relativity or special relativity or about what would happen when things reached the speed of light. He had to be creative in his thinking and come up with these ideas basically with very minimal data. And so you might not think about science as being a creative process, but it really is. To a degree, it's also subjective. That term subjective means that the interpretation might be different depending on who's looking at the data. Certainly, we try to be as objective. Okay, so antonym is objective, which is really just based on the facts. But we all come to data, we all come to science, we all come to our knowledge with different backgrounds, with different upbringings, with different previously held notions. And all of that, our cultural background, our family background, our socioeconomic background, those all have an effect on how we interpret new information, whether it's scientific or otherwise. And so when we look at scientific data, when we build our scientific knowledge, we have to try and be as objective as possible, but we understand that there is certainly a subjectiveness to it. And as part of that, it's also influenced by the social and cultural contexts. The church was certainly a huge social and cultural context throughout history that affected how and when certain scientific knowledge came out. You look at some of the scientists throughout history that were afraid to publish data that went against the teachings of the church for fear of persecution, for fear of death, being arrested. And we see this in other cases throughout history where, and honestly, typically, those social and cultural contexts tend to impede the advancement of science, unfortunately, but they're things that we have to deal with and understand exist. So as we go through the year, and as we mentioned, this idea of subjectivity, what we're going to see, what each of you is going to see, and how you're going to interpret things is going to be based on what we call our perceptual framework. It's how your brain's been trained up to this point in your life to look at new information, to process new information. And it's ultimately a product of all the past experiences that you've had up to this point in your life. And again, that's different for everybody, and it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing because it gives us 10, 15, 20, 26 different sets of eyes, different sets of backgrounds, different frameworks, all looking at the same information. And if we were to just focus on a single point of view, well, then our vision would be cloudy. But if we take into account everybody in the class, if we work together, if we communicate with each other, and we all share our ideas, then we can get a much better picture and a much more accurate picture of what science is, how the world works, and what's going on around us. So, what does it all mean? Ultimately, what we're doing in class this year, the idea behind it all, because I know we're not all going to become physicists, we're not all going to become engineers, we're not all going to be scientists for a profession. The idea this year is to open your mind to new possibilities, to adjust that perceptual framework a little bit, to allow you to look at things that maybe you've experienced every day, old things that are kind of normal to you, that you haven't thought about in a while, and maybe look at them in a new way. Maybe understand a little bit better how those things work, why those things happen, and help you think critically, a little more critically, as you look at things around you in the world. Whether it's information about a new drug, or a decision on who to vote for, or a certain person's thoughts on, when you're talking about politics, right? You have a lot of things related to science now. You get into global warming and things like that. It's important to be able to think critically and to understand what people are saying and not just take it at face value. But also understanding that science is not actually about finding one perfect proven answer. Now, are we going to have situations where you're going to need to do a calculation and there's going to be a right answer and a wrong answer? Absolutely. But there's also an aspect of science that's about growth, it's about development, it's about bringing in new data and new thoughts and new ideas and adjusting our old ideas based on the new information. And so it's a constantly changing, constantly developing process. as we build this foundation, as we build our scientific knowledge and our understanding of the world around us. And I just like this. It's a great picture of a double rainbow. And rainbows are awesome. And we're going to talk about how and why they form. And I think that understanding, whether it's rainbows, whether it's anything, I think understanding how things work, understanding the mechanisms behind them, it helps us to appreciate their impressiveness, their beauty, their awe-inspiring aspects that much more. All right, guys, until next time.